Hi, welcome back to our Apes Flipped Classroom, where today our focus is on human impacts on wetlands and mangroves. So wetlands are going to be familiar to us living where we do, but mangroves are something that you may or may not have ever encountered. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about exactly what those are, but they are a specific type of, well, they grow in a specific type of wetlands. So we're really going to be focusing on human impact on wetlands and mangroves. But before we can jump into talking about human impact, we really need to define what is a wetland. And so a wetland is defined as any area where the soil is submerged or saturated in water for at least part of the year, but it's shallow enough for emergent plants. So emergent plants means ones that have root systems that are down in the benthic zone, but that the plants themselves stick up over the surface of the water. And so things that we typically think of as swamp grasses or wetlands grasses, things that we see on the borders of our rivers in this area, things like cattails and other grasses are emergent plants. So wetland plants are adapted to living with their roots submerged in standing water. Most plants don't like to have their roots in standing water because of the lack of oxygen, but cattails and lily pads and reeds have all adapted to living with their roots submerged in standing water. In our area, we frequently see bald cypress. So bald cypress is another plant that is adapted to living in the wetlands. Wetlands provide a lot of ecosystem services to us as humans. Remember, an ecosystem service is a service provided to humans by an ecosystem, and it usually has a monetary value. So provisioning, in terms of wetlands, they provide habitat for animals. Many of the plants that grow in wetlands are also edible. So we get provisioning services from wetlands. They play a huge role in regulating. So they allow areas for standing water to stand until it has an opportunity to penetrate into the ground and recharge the aquifer. Wetlands absorb flood water, decreasing the impact of flooding on our land, and they are usually large areas of carbon dioxide sequestration. Part of that in the plant life, but part of that also in the decomposing material that tends to sink to the bottom of wetlands. Supporting, again, wetlands tend to be great filtration systems for water. They are habitats, especially for a lot of crucial pollinators. They allow for nutrient cycling, and when they are successful ecosystems, there's a lot of pest control that can occur in a wetlands. So the water that flows into a wetland tends to be heavy in sediment, sometimes even in pollutants, that gets filtered out by its time in the wetlands. Sediment is allowed to settle, contaminants get filtered out, and we have a cleaner water flowing out of our wetlands than we did flowing in. So we have a slow release of that water either to the aquifer or to surface water. And then culturally, wetlands are really valuable as well. There's a lot of tourism revenue, particularly certain areas of wetlands. If you guys have ever been down to the Outer Banks, they do kayak tours. There's a lot of fishing in wetlands, so revenue comes in terms of fishing licenses. You think about the Everglades in Florida, there's a lot of tourism revenue involved there, as well as camping fees, things like that. But also there's a lot of areas of research that happen in wetlands. So educational research or medical research. So what are some of the threats to wetlands? Well, there's lots of pollutants that threaten wetlands. Because they act as that filter, they tend to accumulate a lot of pollutants. So if we have issues with nutrient overload in the incoming water, that can lead to problems in the wetlands. That sediment, if sediment is too heavy, and we'll talk about this particularly when we talk about the mangroves as well, if the sediment load is too heavy, that can actually prevent the roots of those wetland adapted plants from being able to absorb what they need from the water or the air. Motor oil, again, because we have a lot of runoff coming into wetlands, so that tends to, if it's washing motor oil off of roads. Pesticides coming from agriculture, and then of course those same endocrine disruptors that we've been talking about. And because a lot of wetlands serve as sort of nurseries for aquatic species, those endocrine disruptors can be a significant impact on the health of a wetland ecosystem. Very often wetlands are filled in or drained so that the area can be developed into homes or parking lots or stores or agricultural land. Many people view wetlands as a waste of space. This dates all the way back to the founding of our country. You think about George Washington was one of the surveyors involved in the draining of the Great Dismal Swamp, which was not entirely successful, but it was certainly an effort at the time. So we've been draining wetlands since we've been settling the United States. This is a major issue in Florida, along with water diversion upstream that happens, whether that happens for flood control or for agricultural purposes or for drinking water. This can reduce the water flow and it can dry up wetlands. So that's a major issue in the Everglades, as is the fact that the Everglades, like the Great Dismal Swamp, there were efforts to drain the Everglades to increase the amount of saleable land in Florida. Dam construction for flood control reduces the water flow. It also reduces the sediment, which means that there's fewer nutrients flowing to the wetlands. So nutrients are always a fine balance. You want enough to keep an area healthy, but not so much to push it into eutrophication. So our image down here to the right shows historically the amount of water that flowed into the Everglades versus what flows into the Everglades now. And you can see that there's a substantial reduction in the amount of water that flows in, as well as the amount of water that flows out. Another major threat to wetlands is overfishing, and that can be overfishing in the wetland itself or in areas that it accesses. So when we think about some of the wetlands associated with the Chesapeake Bay, the fishing might be occurring in the bay, but it does impact the wetland because it interrupts the food web of the wetland. So if you decrease the predators, then you're also going to have an increase in prey and we're going to be out of balance. So how can we solve this? One big way is by planting what are called riparian buffers. So these are buffer zones of plants along the edges of rivers and streams, and that allows those buffers to do some of the filtration work before the water gets to the wetlands. Properly managing the animal manure, particularly at concentrated animal feeding operations. Planting and keeping cover crops, because by keeping those cover crops, you reduce the amount of flow of sediment off the land and into the water. So that affects both sediment and nutrient runoff. We can talk about enhanced nutrient removal when it comes to wastewater treatment. So wastewater plants we'll talk about later on in this unit. And so making sure that they are removing nutrients before the water is returned to the stream. On a smaller level, septic tank upgrades. So people who have septic systems need to properly maintain them and make sure that they are not allowing nutrients to flow into waterways. And then buffer zones for areas where you have lots of roads and therefore lots of runoff. Okay, let's talk about mangroves. So mangroves are a specific type of tree, and they are a type of tree like a bald cypress, although much smaller, that grows at the water's edge. And mangroves tend to grow with their roots in the benthic zone at the edge of a wetlands. They'll have part of the roots exposed to the air. Those parts of the roots might be covered at certain times by water and exposed at other times. So mangroves, if you guys have ever been down to the Florida Keys, are really common down in that area. They tend to ring a lot of the keys, and they are pretty much responsible for holding the soil in place for the keys. So mangroves are a great protection against erosion and against damage from storms. In fact, it's been shown that restoring mangroves is 5 times more effective cost-wise than creating concrete or stone buffers or piers, breakwaters. So in terms of coastal protection, mangroves are a huge protection factor. One of the issues that mangroves are having is that their roots do need to be exposed to air at least part of the day, because like the bald cypress, that's how they obtain oxygen for their processes, is through the exposed area of their roots. When there are major flooding events, sometimes the mangroves get coated in mud, and that mud doesn't allow the oxygen to penetrate, and that will actually kill the tree. There's also lots of other services that mangroves provide. In addition to erosion control and breakwater services, they're fantastic storage for carbon, 3 to 5 times higher than other forest or tree types, because they store lots of carbon in the soil because of their extensive root system. They're a big tourism attraction. They're a fantastic nursery for fish, because the exposed root system is a great hiding place for young fish and crabs and even shrimp. There's lots of tourism attractions of touring the mangroves or going fishing in the mangroves. And its wood actually makes it a valuable source of timber and of fuel. So mangroves provide lots of ecosystem services, and they serve kind of a unique niche in ecosystems. So why are we losing mangroves? Well, logging. In areas of Southeastern Asia, there's lots of places where mangrove stands have been converted into rice paddies. So there's lots of loss for agriculture, just like there's lots of loss of the Amazon rainforest for agriculture. Aquaculture, so especially shrimp farming, actually has eliminated a lot of mangroves. And coastal development, as well as climate change. So as sea level rises, more and more of the mangroves root systems are underwater, and that obviously is not something that they can survive long term. So those are our threats to mangroves, and we talked about the benefits. All right, so our practice FRQ takes us back to water pollutants and makes it specific to our wetlands. So I want you to describe how one specific human activity can lead to increased phosphorus levels in an estuary ecosystem. So an estuary, a wetland. And I want you to describe one step that could be taken to reduce the amount of phosphorus that comes from the activity that you described in the first part. All right. As always, I look forward to hearing your questions and seeing you in class.